All right, welcome back. We are COMP125 in the summer 2020 semester, and it is week 5, part 1 of our broadcast. We're talking about working with the document object model, or the DOM. Kind of interesting how the DOM works, and we'll talk about it. But first, let's take a look at where we are and what we should be doing. So, speaking to your previous professor, Patrick, on assignment number 2, he was waiting for the transition to happen. So what's going to happen is that this Thursday I'm going to announce assignment number 2, and it's going to be a combination of assignment number 2 and assignment number 3, so that we can keep on track with everybody else. All right, so that's what's coming up this Thursday. It will be probably not a crazy amount of difficulty, but will include things like DOM manipulation and probably some kind of a mix of that and form validation and a couple other things we're going to add in. So at the end of the day, expect a new assignment coming up on Thursday. So for people who are saying that we're getting an assignment every 24 hours, guess what? Wednesday, we're going to get another one. I keep thinking Thursday. My days are so kind of full. So that's what's coming. So Wednesday, you're going to get a new assignment, okay, the next day. So that's coming up on Thursday, or Wednesday, Thursday. You know what it is? All the classes. Some are Wednesday, some are Thursday. You guys are on Wednesday. So we'll see you guys on Wednesday for that. And so I want to talk about a couple things today. I guess some of the way we got to today, I probably would have got here a little faster. So things like what we worked on last day, I probably would have been able to do probably by week 3, maybe even faster than that. But we had to learn a little bit about JavaScript and kind of its ins and outs. So today we're going to probably be talking about the first time we're going to hook into or connect to the document object model. And I'm just going to turn one of my things off. I don't want to be distracted by the WWDC 2020, which is running on the background right now. It's killing me to know what's all the new stuff. All right, tell me, let's go to the next part. So really, more tools. Are we going to be talking about more tools? Maybe more tools today. We'll see how it goes. And like I said, assignment 2 on Wednesday. But really what we want to talk about is how to hook into, it says access. This word is kind of interesting. I like to think about it as hooking into or getting a reference to an ID, a tag name, a class name, a selector. We're going to be able to do that after today. We're going to be able to also add and remove document nodes. We'll talk about what that is. And how to create and close new browser tabs. Probably hit that today or on Wednesday. Okay, let's see how that goes. So it also talks about things like how to set a timeout or an interval. Those are very interesting as they create a new thread. And how to use the history, location, navigation, and screen objects. There's like the whole bunch of stuff we can learn. As you can see in this slide deck, there's 74 slides. I'm not going to hit them all today, but definitely we're going to kind of to get everything that we need over the next couple days. Anyway, today and then Wednesday. All right, so I want to start with code, which is like where I like to start. Really, I like to use the PowerPoints as a backdrop. But we've been learning about functions a little bit. You've learned that there's 3 or 4 different ways to create a function last day. And one thing to note is that a function is an object, which is a little different when it comes to the way JavaScript handles functions than other languages. In fact, most of the things in JavaScript are objects, which is interesting, right? It's very similar in some ways to when I think about Python. There's some similarities between the languages. So there's a couple things. There's the document object model, which is the actual document itself. And there's also this thing called the browser object model, which is really, you have something called the window object, which represents the web browser. And really what we can do is we can include or not include, it's almost like some of the functions we can get from the window object, or think about this as the window class, automatically. And you can see here how it works. So the window is, let's say, the base object in the browser object model. And the window basically has access to the history. Think about the window as the browser, right? The history, your location. There's something called the navigator we'll talk about. the screen, and as well as the document, right? So in order for us to get to the document object model, we have to go through the window. It's pretty simple, right? So here's the BOM, the browser object model, and here's the DOM, the document object model, which we're going to get to in a sec. Okay. So let's talk about the document object, right? So basically, where the browser is represented by the BOM, the window, right? The document itself, the thing that's inside the browser, is represented by the DOM, right? So a different thing, document object model. What we can do is we can connect to each of the elements inside of the document through JavaScript. Okay. So there was something at the time, way back, called dynamic HTML, all right? And really when we think about dynamic HTML, what is that? It's almost like rich kind of content, right? It was a term that was used pre-Web 2.0. Now that we're going into kind of like the Web 3.0 and beyond, dynamic HTML is really kind of not something we talk about anymore. We more talk about things like responsive web design, adaptive web design, so that it can go from one viewport to another, right? But at the time, it was kind of a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and the DOM was this application programming interface that we tapped into to enable dynamic functionality with HTML, right? So here we have an example of a page, and the DOM has a particular hierarchy. And I think this word is a really cool word because basically, I'm sorry guys, I'm getting some crosstalk. But basically, we talk about hierarchy. And what hierarchy is if you think about it, is a series of what we call nodes. So let's take a look at that. So here's the document. That's at the higher end of the root of the hierarchy. And then inside the document, there's something called HTML. That's the tag, HTML element, right? And inside the HTML element, there's two other nodes. One is the head, and the other one is the body, right? Let's take a look at that in code. So I'm just going to go to Visual Studio Code here. Well, last day we had a couple things. We had COMP125 M2020 Lesson 4, and we also have COMP125 M2020 Lesson 4 Part 2. I want to go to this one, but I don't want to use this one. I want to copy this one, and we're going to do that a bunch of times here when we're together. So let's do this right now. So the way it works is if I right-click and if I copy, and if I Control-V or right-click and paste, whatever you want, on the desktop or wherever you're storing your stuff, right? Then what it'll do is it'll make a copy of everything. But notice that it takes a while. So the reason why it takes so long is because we've included in both this folder and this folder all of the node modules that are part of the structure that we've created. Why? Because whenever we download node modules, the node modules folder, right, as an example, it can take like really, really long to make a copy. Let's stop this for a second, and let's kill this, and let's go on and show you a quick way to do it. So I'm just going to kill this now. So inside of COMP125, right, this folder, you can see that I have node modules in here. Remember that node modules we downloaded and installed through npm install or yarn install. Or yarn add. Those are the two things to do. So if we just go here to node modules, and if we right click and shift delete, right, so I want to get rid of them, what it's going to do is it's going to kind of lighten our load when it comes to copying. The other thing we want to do is we want to be careful. We're going to also copy the .git folder, and I want to talk about ways of transitioning from one workspace to another, keeping our commits, the things we found, but changing our remote where it points to. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. So first, let's copy that again. We'll see what the difference is. So Control-C, Control-V, and let's see the difference in speed. All right, so much faster. You can see that there's way less to copy over, right? And you can see that that happens much faster. And that's what I recommend. So kill the node modules folder, and now when we're in here, we can always reinstall node modules, and I'll show you how to do that. But next, let's rename the folder from M2020 Lesson 4 Part 2 to M2020 Lesson 5, which is what this is, and then I'm not sure if there's going to be a part 2. Let's just make a lesson 5. All right, there's our new folder. So we have 3 folders now. The one from the first day, the one from the second day, and the one from the third day. Okay. What happens if I delete these 2? That's okay. I got both of these 2 up on GitHub. So let's do that now. I can just get rid of it. And I can work with the latest folder that I have right here, this one. By the way, notice how I didn't press Shift Delete, and it's taking its sweet time. It's copying all this inside my recycle bin. All right. Anyways, let's bring up Visual Studio Code. Again, it's the blue icon, not the purple icon, right? And VS Code creates an untitled folder. I'm just going to drag and drop from my desktop and COMP125 onto VS Code, just like before. When it does, I'm able to then double click. You can see my structure, and everything is there except for node modules. I need to get node modules back because if you remember, on my index.html, it hooks into node modules, and that folder doesn't exist anymore. So what we can do is we can press Control backtick. Control backtick brings up our terminal. You can always go through Terminal, New Terminal. Okay, that also brings it up, a new terminal window. Okay, but here I'm just going to go to Control backtick, and then we're just going to say yarn add, or sorry, yarn install. If I just do yarn install and enter, it's going to look at my package.json file, and I've got all my node modules back. Right. So whenever it comes to storing node modules online, right, as an example, then it makes sense for us not to include them. Okay, so instead of me including node modules every single time in my package and putting it up to GitHub, you can see now that I have 774 new files that are, that I'm going to put up on GitHub right from node modules, right? So, as an example, that's a lot. We could ignore those. However, for now, we're going to leave them alone, and I'll show you why in a bit. Let's clear the screen. So we got all these new modules we want to track. That's in node modules, right? And right now what's happening is you can't see it, but if I was to do a directory, right? Oops, not there. Here, if I do a directory, you can see that I just see this stuff. I don't see the empty or the hidden.git folder, right? Now, if I'm using PowerShell, sometimes PowerShell will give me some Linux-like commands, but there's some that I really love, like ls. Right? ls works, but actually ls is an alias for dir, dir. I can't do the advanced functionality of ls, like for example ls -al, which I want to do. It doesn't work because there is no real ls command, right? One thing to note is when I look at my functionality, right, on the desktop, I can see that I have a hidden folder because it's kind of grayed out. If I go to view, I can get that hidden folder or not. If I click on hidden items, then it disappears. However, if I want to see it, I can click on it again and it reappears. So this .git folder is a hidden folder that's storing my Git repository. Remember we talked about Git being a way of taking a snapshot of our files and then sending the snapshot up to GitHub, right? We've kind of talked about that a little bit. But one thing we know is that I have a remote repository that I've created, a remote connection to GitHub. It's called Origin right now, right? And we know we can get that from our Visual Studio Code. So if I go back up to VS Code, I'm back in the terminal, and if I do a clear or CLS, it clears the terminal just like we had before. And if I want to see the remote, first of all, let me take a look at Git right now. So if I go Git status, it's going to show me that I'm on the branch master and everything is up to date. According to, when you compare what I have here to up online. But wait a minute, this is a brand new repository. What this means is if I continue working with this repository, it's actually going to modify my current repo up online. But my current repo online is called lesson 4 part 2, right? I need to make a new repository. And I need to point to it as opposed to the one I'm pointing to right now. How do I know this? Well, let's take a look at Git remote. Notice I have a remote already. The remote, remember, is just a friendly name for a connection that connects to GitHub. It's called Origin. And this Origin remote points to the previous remote, the previous repository. So what I need to do is delete it. And the way to do this is go git remote remove origin. And then when I do it again, if I go git remote, you can see now that there is no remote. I don't have a remote. I'm not destroying the git repository because I want to keep my commits, all the history of what I'm doing. I just want to make a new repository and continue working there. So I'm going to go to GitHub. And I'm going to look at Centennial College. That's our Git repository, right? Or my account. And you can see here's last week's repository, COMP125, M2020, Lesson 4, Part 2. We're going to make a new one. I'm going to go here. And by default, it's private. I want to make it public, right? So I don't forget that. I want to call it COMP125 in the summer, M for summer, 2020 semester. And it's Lesson 5. Now, I'm not going to differentiate between Part 1 and Part 2 yet. Just Lesson 5, right? One thing you don't want to do is you don't want to initialize the repository with a README. If you do, it will not be compatible with what you have in your current repository on your computer, right? You don't want to add a .gitignore file for the same reasons or a license file. So don't click any of these, all right, when you make a new repository, if you're going to carry your repository over. Then I just simply want to click Create Repository. You don't have to do the same thing. If you want to watch, you can watch me. And now that I have this, once I create a repository, it gives me some steering instructions like I talked about before. Git, and then init, we've already done this. Git add dot, we added every file so far. Git commit -m, first commit, or initial commit is what I used, right? But now we got these two new lines of code. So what I could do is just right click and copy, and then lazily go over to my terminal and just right click, just by itself, right click. If I right click in Windows, it automatically pastes the first line and pastes the second line, but doesn't enter it yet. All I have to do then is just press enter, and then it does the next line of code. And what this will do is it'll push my current commits up to the new repository and connect to it. And this is the process that I would ask you to use when you move from one repository to another with the same commits, okay? Now, some of you might ask, is this a good process? And I mean, if you're going to keep a history, and like I'm doing, and I'm kind of keeping the same development history, but I'm moving to another repository altogether, it's totally fine to do, right? However, most of the time, what we want to do in real life is move to another branch. For us, this is easier. Okay, so now that we've got that connected, if I go back up to this repository and refresh, you can see that now I have my old commits, my 3 commits that I made 5 days ago here, right? With node modules and everything else intact. Okay, and this is the branch that we're going to be using going forward, or this repository, today and on Wednesday. All right, so now that we have this, I'm going to clear the screen. You can also use CLS to clear the screen. A couple things I have to change. Here's something. It's going from Lesson 4 to Lesson 5. Right? That's something I should probably change. And you know, there is this thing of a README file. README.md is what I can add in. I can add a new README file. Let me show you what it looks like if I was going to make a change up online, if someone else made a change online, and if I was going to pull something. First of all, let's make a simple push first. So I've changed the name here in my index.html to Lesson 5, and that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go here and just go to the built-in Git and GitHub connection. You can see that I've got my index.html, and that has been modified. That's what M means. And if you hover over, it actually tells you modified, right? I'm going to go up here to the same level where it says changes and click the plus button. Stage all changes. That's what it says. So this button here includes now index.html into a new commit that we haven't made yet, right? If you hover over this little icon, it says I open a file and I've made some modifications, right? If I go to my message now, I can add a new message. For example, modified index.html to display the proper lesson. Right? That's what I did, right? Lesson 5 instead of Lesson 4. Then I can just click this checkbox or check mark right here, which does the commit. So that actually takes care of git add dot and git commit -m and the message, right? If I check now, if I go here to my command line and I say git log shows me that that's exactly what I did. So added a second function, and finally I come to here, modified index.html to display the proper lesson. That is the commit I just made, and I did it right through Visual Studio. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to push this to the GitHub repo, and if I go to the ellipses here where it says more actions, if I click onto it, I can just push. I can also push to a specific location, but for now this is good enough. I want to push. So I can push, it does the git push origin master command for me, and now as you see this little bar, it's pushed to the web. If I go back to my repository, I should have a fourth commit when I refresh. You see now that I have a fourth commit, and all I've done is modified this file. It actually tells you where it's been modified index.html. This line here tells you the commit, the last commit, whatever it was, that modified the file or folder or whatever. Okay. But let's suppose I want to add a README file now up on my GitHub, or someone else did it. Let's say I'm collaborating with somebody else and they did something online. Let's add a README file. A README file is kind of a very descriptive file, and right now you notice that I've got a hashtag here in the README file, COMP125 M2020 lesson 5, right? And I can actually add some additional data. By the way, the hashtag is like a heading 1. This is markdown, not markup. HTML is hypertext markup language. MD, right? The .md extension is for markdown. It's another kind of markup language. So you can say double hashtag is like an H2 tag in HTML. And I can say demo project for COMP125. Let's call it client-side scripting. It's not really called that, but anyways. And then, lesson 5. So a little bit more of a description. And if I scroll down here, you can see that I can commit a new file, and it's going to use this commit message, create readme.md, right? Let's do that. And when I do that on the Git repository itself, it gives me this little readme. And readmes can be used for things like installation instructions, wiki, in terms of documentation, all kinds of wonderful things can be put here in the MD file, right? However, now we have a problem. I have an MD file. I have a file that's up online that I don't have locally here in my repository. Notice that in my folder, I don't have a .md file. I need to get it. And the way to get that is to pull. So there's two ways to do that. I could just say git pull. I could do that and press enter. Or if you want to use the built-in Git tools as part of Visual Studio, again, I would just go over to my ellipses and then just say pull, which would be the exact same way. All right, so let's do this one. Let's just do the one that's built in. So if I click pull, then it's going to go up and pull the latest changes. And now, once it's done, if I go over to my folder, you can now see that I have my readme.md file that it actually downloaded from my repository on GitHub. And there it is, COMP125. And by the way, I have a little previewer that I downloaded, and you can see what it looks like on the right-hand side. Okay? So that is how you pull stuff from GitHub. You can push to GitHub, you can share your files, and then you can pull from GitHub. I'm also going to, at this point, we're sitting at 2:54. I think this is plenty of time for people to get here. I'm just going to lock the meeting and enable the waiting room. So anyone new that comes in, we go to the waiting room first so that we don't get interrupted. By the way, I really do appreciate people naming themselves properly. Thank you for that. All right, so now that we know how to do that, right, and I have a brand new file and folder, I also have other things I can modify that I forgot. For example, my package.json is also incorrectly named lesson 4 part 1. I could change this, and I'll do that now. So I'll just call this lesson 5. Do I really have to? Is going to be your question. No, but I mean, if you want to be correct in the way you do stuff and you want to document things properly, then this would be the better way to do it. I'm going to save this. I'm not going to make a commit just for my package.json, although I could. I could just make a new commit and then say change package.json as an example, to less than 5 to reflect the lesson. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to make another bigger commit later on, but you can see that here I've modified one file. It tells you that this package.json file has been modified. All right, and it keeps track of everything. That's one great thing about Git and GitHub. It does file tracking. Any kind of changes, it just tracks every file and folder that's been changed or even added or removed. Okay, so that's this. Now let's talk about the stuff that we're talking about today. So I'm going to go to my scripts folder, into my app.js, and last day we talked about a couple things, very simple things, how to make functions. I made 2 functions, start and second. I'm going to clean this up and get rid of second and get rid of this one, the reference to second. And this is okay. App started, color white, font size 24 pixels, right? And that's great. And let's just get rid of this just to make some room. Fantastic. So I've modified my little function. Again, my function is in this format is an immediately invoked function expression. That's what this is. All right, which is kind of cool. And what I want to do now is I want to connect, right? Somehow I want to connect my page, my app.js, over to my index.html. Remember last day I had my index.html and I added a nav bar, which is this. This is using Bootstrap's built-in CSS styles, right? And I want to use the same nav bar, but I want to be able to hook into it. So when I click on items on the page, I get notified in my app.js, right? So let's do a couple things. First, let's enable our developer view. So I'm going to just restore the size of my page, okay? If you haven't got the right size of your page and you want to make it half the size or somewhat like half the size of your monitor, just change the size that you're seeing here. Whenever you do side-by-side anything, be careful because there's a big spot here that's going to be for your solution. You can probably give yourself more room by just moving this around and seeing part of this. And by the way, if this isn't enough, you can just hide this altogether so you can see as much of your code here as possible. I'd like to work side by side, and I'm going to use my existing web browser to do that. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to restore again, and there's a quick way to do that on Windows, but I'm not going to use that way. Just going to make it so that I can see both sides, right? Where I have my browser on one side and I have my Visual Studio Code on the other side. And I highly recommend doing this because you can see the changes immediately on this side, right? But to enable that, I'm going to go Control over here on VS Code and press Control backtick again. I'm going to hide my folder view, and then I'm going to type in light server. And light server is a package that we downloaded last week, and now you can see that I've got my hello world. I also have everything we did last day with home, product, services, about us, and contact us, our 5-page site. All right. Which hint is going to be one of your assignments, and I'm going to get you to do. You're going to make your own 5-page site, but we'll talk about that on Wednesday. Okay, so here's Hello World as an example, and what I want to do is I want to add a button to Hello World. I'm going to hide the terminal for now because I know it's running, and I'm going to scroll all the way down until I get to this area here that is on my line. If you copied me, between line 51 and 55, there is this H1 tag on line 53. So inside the Jumbotron, right, inside the Jumbotron, which is this little gray box that you see here, I have Hello World, and I want to put in a button. So what I can do is I can just type the word button, and I can style it. If I just did button and then pasted it and saved it, I would just get a button that's kind of blank, right? I mean, if I put a name in there, like for example, we'll make it the click me button and save it, well, right away you get this really unstyled button right here, right? To take advantage of Bootstrap, let's do this all again. What you could do is just do something like this. Button with a class of button primary. And then inside the button, I want to kind of say something like click me. All right, and if I click on this thing now, you're going to get something that looks like this: a button with a class of button primary. Button itself tells Bootstrap that it's a button. Button primary colors it to blue. And if I save, now you're going to get a nicer looking button. And with some pretty cool effects too, built in out of the box. So that's kind of where I want to go. The click me button. Okay, cool. What I want to do here is when I click the click me button, this is my, what I want to do. I want to be able to show something in the console. So let's just do that. So I'm going to open up the inspector. You can always get to that by Control-Shift-I, right? And when I open up the inspector, I want to go to console, right? And my console says app started right now, and it's still retaining the kind of style that I put into it last time, which is like kind of this white style that I have. Now I'm using, my browser allows me to do this, and I also have a built-in dark mode for my browser, right? Right now my current state is light, but I can always go to dark mode. And you can see that when I go to dark mode, it retains the dark toolbar in the background, but this part right here becomes dark because I haven't necessarily styled my background to be any color. If I wanted to style my background to always be white, even in dark mode, I'd have to change my CSS in order for me to do that. Let's switch back to light mode. All right, so here app started. You can see that that's happening, and when I click on this button, right? When I click on this button, I want to show down here that I've clicked on it. Now, there's easy ways to do this, and I can do things a couple ways. One, in the book, it'll tell you to kind of do it inline, right? And by the way, we talked about this when it comes to coding. I never want to do JavaScript here, ever. I want to do JavaScript here in my app.js. And if I did that, then I could affect more than one page. But that also presents a problem, which we'll talk about in a second. So first, I want to be able to do something when I click on this button. But we just talked about the document object model. And if you looked at the document object model, here's the document, here's your HTML, you've got your head, you've got your body. And if I go back to code, right, here's what we have. Here's the HTML. This is the outside tag, right? Inside that, you have your HTML tag. This is your HTML tag. Inside there, you have two tags. And by the way, you can collapse them with Visual Studio Code. Here's my head. And here's my body, right? That's exactly the same way. HTML is the outside tag. Head is the inside. And so is body. Head and body are siblings of each other. Why? Because they're on the same level, right? Head and body are sibling nodes. That's what they are. Think about this as a tree structure, right? Where the top is the root of the tree, and as it goes down, we have different leaves, right? So if you notice here, I have another branch, head, and branch, the head branch has, again, a couple of nodes, some meta tags that you have, as well as the title tag, okay? Going back to that, if I look at the head, you can see that that is the case. I have some meta nodes, here are the meta nodes, as well as the title node, and then there are 3 link nodes, okay? Each of these things is accessible through code, by the way. Even the stuff that's hidden. Normally the head part of your web page is hidden, but that's a built-in style of the browser. If I really want to, I can make the head visible, right? And we can do that through code. We can also do that through CSS if you really want to, okay? But I'm just showing you that this is a node that contains other nodes. Think about your head as the container node, and each of these other nodes as the child nodes that are contained inside, okay? So that's how this works. Similarly, the body has a bunch of nodes, and I have separated it on purpose into a bunch of containers. For example, I have the header, I have main, and I have the footer. And notice that when I collapse these nodes, they don't go away, they're just collapsible areas. So here's the body, and under the body I have right now 3 sibling nodes plus a couple of other sibling nodes down here, a few other ones down here. So header, main, footer, and these 3 script nodes are all inside the body as siblings. They're the same level. Similarly over here, you can see body, and there's a header and an article and maybe some other stuff. Those are kind of like brother-sister nodes. And think about this as the parent node. And this is the parent node of that node. And this is the parent node of that node. So that's kind of how the document object model is kind of set up in this DOM tree kind of idea. So what if I want to get access to something that's inside of my body? Well, I got to point to exactly where I'm looking, right? That's how it works. I got to get a reference, almost like a memory address, to the place I'm looking. And the way that works is you can do that by hooking into it, and I say hook. I make these like air quotes. Hook into it by with a couple ways of doing this, okay? And so I'll talk about the most popular way of doing it, which is with ID, right? So to start off, I would have to look in the document, and I know where it is. It's inside main. I don't care about the header right now. That's where the nav bar is, so that's why I've collapsed it. I'm looking in main, and inside main, you see that there is a button called the Click Me button, okay? I want to specifically target this button, all right? Just this button alone. So what I can do is I can add an ID. Okay, so let's add an ID as an attribute. I'm just going to make this large again so we have more real estate, okay? So what I can do is I can say my ID for this button is equal to, right, the Click Me button. Click Me button. You can name this whatever you want. This is almost like your own naming convention that you have. Typically what I do is I use camel case for this. So whatever the thing is that I'm connecting to, a button, right? And the name for the button, Click Me. That's what the button is called. That's what I'm using as an ID. So this is one of the most popular ways to connect to it. When I say connect or access, I mean make a reference to. It's almost like I'm pointing to it. I'm going to draw this in a bit, but you'll understand in a second. Then once I have the name, this enables me, this gives me the ability to connect to it, right? So going back to code, I need to make a reference to it. Now, I want to do it in my start function. I don't want to put typically any variables out here, because if I put a variable out here, it's inside this entire function scope. Remember that? I want to keep the scope low, and I want to put a variable in here. So let's name a variable, let, and we'll call it the name of the thing I'm trying to connect to. Click Me button, typically is what you call it, the same thing. And then you make it equal to something. Now remember, we could use explicit object naming conventions using the .accessor method. For example, I could say window.document. And then the name of what I'm using, which is create element by ID, or get element by ID. However, let's see if I can do it simpler. If I just go get element by ID, right? I can't do that. I still need to reference at least the document itself. So I can say document dot get element by ID. So that's the method that I'm using to connect. There's several different methods. This is the first one. And it tells you what it is. I'm going to get a reference to the element or tag, right, by ID, which is what we set up already. Okay, so this is the ID, Click Me button. All right, I'm going to save this, by the way. If I don't save it, then I won't be able to do it. And then I'm going to search. What this get element by ID does is it searches for an ID that matches somewhere in the document. That's what it does. So I'm going to open brackets, and it tells me what I need. I need an ID string. It's got to be the exact same ID that I've used, and it's case sensitive. So make sure it's the exact same, or else it won't work. Okay? So then I put in Click Me button, because that's what I called it, right? Notice I don't have to put the hashtag, okay? Just the ID name, and then a semicolon. Now, if I hover over Click Me button, it tells me that Click Me button has now been changed. The data type has changed to an HTML element. Visual Studio Code is smart enough to understand this. Okay? That's pretty cool. That Click Me button is now a HTML element. And also, it's not used. Why? Because my Click Me button is grayed out. See how it's grayed out? But this is blue, and this is blue. A little bit, a different kind of blue. So I want to use this thing, and let's do this. I'm going to say that console.log, and we'll output the Click Me button. Click Me button. Notice it comes up. Now, as soon as I do that, guess what? It lights up again. lights up means it's not gray anymore. It's changed color. Let me show you that again. If I undo that, notice how it's gray? And then when I start typing the rest of it, code completion, basically, as soon as I'm done, it lights up. It tells you, Visual Studio Code tells you that, hey, now I'm using it for the first time. Otherwise, it'll be gray. And if it's gray, that means it's a piece of code that I've written that's unused. We never want to have that. All right, so now that's cool. I'm going to save this. And if I go back, so I'm just going to double click here. If I go back to side-by-side mode, right, which is what I was trying to do, you can see now that I've got a reference. And if I hover over it, actually highlights the button. Look, see, hover over. It actually shows me, it returns a button element. Button, class, button primary, ID of click me button. If that makes any sense. Are you with me? Do you have to use Bootstrap for the assignment, or can we use regular CSS Flexbox? That's up to you. However, I recommend Bootstrap because I'm showing you a whole new framework, and it's good for you to learn if you haven't learned it already. All right. So that's simple. The simple thing is I've connected to this button. This button actually exists, and you can see that it does because it's pointing to the button that's inside of the index.html file, right? Okay, now that I've pointed to it, that's what this does. This gets a reference. What do I mean by reference? Well, let's do a simple drawing for a second. So remember the document object model that we talked about, right? So remember, it's like a hierarchy, right? Or hierarchy. So I have these nodes, right? And this node, let's say, is the HTML node. Let's put that in there. Let's recreate it a little bit. You may be asked to do that on a test, by the way. Say, hey, if this is the HTML node, what's the parent node, if there is one? It's like not a trick question, but you should know kind of the answers to that. And then, okay, cool. I have my HTML node, and then I have inside there, I have two nodes, right? I have my head, and I have my body. I'm gonna draw them out in a second. I don't care about my head right now, but let's name it. So this is head, right? That's how the structure. You need to know this because if you don't know this, then you won't understand how to put things together in JavaScript. Here's body. Okay, so then these are the two elements, and again they're connected, right? They're connected just like like a tree structure. So you can see that there's a connection between these elements here, just like we said before. Now I have a special node that I just made, and this node inside my body node, and this isn't accurate, okay, because it's not exactly under the body, but it's inside the body under a div tag. Actually, if we wanted to really try hard to do this, it's inside main, and inside main there's another one. But let's say there's a button called, there's a node called a button. Okay, here we go. Let's just say it's like this instead. Okay, I'm not going to go through the entire hierarchy. And we're just going to put some ... here. So it's like, I want you to think about me when I put ... that maybe there's some kind of other nodes, but the button is inside the body node. That's very important to understand. And I want to hook into it with JavaScript, right? So when I use document.element, if I use document.getElement by ID, by the way, this is actually case sensitive. Well, I gotta kind of access the name of the ID for that particular button. So whatever the ID name is, right? And what this does, it says, hey, go find an element with this ID name. It didn't say go find the button. Go find an element, any element in the page, in the document with that ID name. Okay? How come, what happens if, though, I don't find it? So here's JavaScript on this side. It says go find it, right? Well, here, in this particular case, if there was a button, and let's say, for example, ID name was the button's name. So let's put that in there. So ID, the button would have an attribute of ID, and there would be ID name, let's say. Okay. So if this attribute existed, for this button, then this search criteria, think about this as a selector, if you will, right? Then, I mean, it would sit there and go, okay, so is it here? No. Okay, is it here? No. Oh, wait, there's one. And it'll take the first one, the first element that has ID name at the beginning, and it'll just say, hey, that's an element with an ID name, right? So this thing here says, I have a reference now. It's almost like I have an arrow that points to this thing. It hooks into this particular button with an ID of ID name. That's what it does. But it searches the entire body first, okay? So here's a couple questions. What if I have multiple items with ID name, okay? Well, that can pose a problem, but we'll talk about that in 1 second. So what happens if we don't find this? Let's say if I go back to my index.html, right, and I comment it out. So I commented out. Here's a comment. I'm just going to take half of this comment, and I'm going to put it on the other side over here. There we go. So I've commented it out. So there's no more button. If I save it, you can see the button goes away. All right. And now notice what I get down here. I get null. That makes sense, right? So I've gone through, right, and I've connected to the button, right? I've tried to connect to the button with code. Here's my code. My code says, hey, find a button or an element, any element, not a button, it could be anything, that has click me button associated with it. Okay, it went through and then assigned the result to this click me button variable, right? This HTML element. And then it says, output this HTML element, output that out here, right? And if you notice, because there isn't anything, I'm getting a result of null. Guys, null is a bad result. Okay? Null is a bad result. And the reason why null is a bad result is because if I want to do anything else with that thing, like, I don't know, print something else, that click me button, it's almost like I have access to the entire button itself. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Like, it's almost like I have direct access. It's a representation now. Click me button represents this element in here if it existed. However, it doesn't exist. And because HTML elements can have things like attributes, and if I do some other operation, right, as an example, on this click me button, I will get an error that can crash my code. All right? So it's like I want to check to see that it's not null. All right? Because I'm getting null here, right? So let's not do a console log unless it's not null. Let's do that. And the way to do that is if you check it. If I go click me button, if it exists, right? That's what that means. If it's not null, right? Then do a console log, right? But don't do a console log if it is null. So now notice I don't get the null. I don't even do this command anymore, right? Because I'm saying, hey, check to see if click me button exists. If you really want to be more specific, you can say if click me button is not equal to null, right? If it's not equal to null, right? And if you did this, you wouldn't get it either. But either way, whether you do this or whether if you just say, does it exist, this alone is good enough to check to see that there is a reference that's been created by document.getElementById. Okay, if you don't have this check, bad things can happen. So please have some kind of check going on if you do this kind of referencing. Okay, and we'll talk about different methods to do this. So, all right, so that's what that does. And like we talked about, each item in the DOM is a node, and element, attribute, and text content nodes are most commonly used. All right, we'll talk about what those are. And here is the first way of doing it. We talked about getElementById. It returns the element with the ID, value, ID, whatever that is. There's also getElementsByClassName. Be careful. Look what it says here. Elements. Not one, multiple. GetElements. GetElements. Okay, and there's other ones. It says if one class name, class 1, is specified, returns the collection of elements. It's like an array. An array of elements is what it's returned here. Okay? This returns the element. But what if, remember I talked about this, but I have more than one? Does it return them all? Let's take a look. So what if I go back to my index.html and uncomment this? Okay, so there, I got one back. And now you can see that when I do that, I get my button, and I can see my button again. Let's make another one. Let's make another button. And let's add that button in there again. And let's go, we'll call this click me 2. So we can see visually it's different. All right, here's click me number 2. And if I save this and run, you can see if I hover over, it returns the first one. See that? The first element that matches, it returns, but not the second one, even though they have the exact same ID. Okay? Okay, but what if I wanted to get all elements that have the button tag, right? So that's another way of returning stuff. I can hook into this in different ways. So going back to this then, if I go back to my code and go to my app.js, so this returns a single element, the first one it finds. Okay? But I can also say let buttons equal to document dot, and notice that there's other things. Get elements by tag name. That's a thing to do too. Let's do that. And then it searches for that particular tag. So notice what you can search for. Different things it gives you, and a bunch more, 66 more. If I start typing the word button, right, you can see that button works. It actually gives me a hint, right? Let's try that again. So if I was to try typing it, and then I said, these are all the different types, I can search for it. I can scroll down and select it as well. I can go here, button, I want that one, right? So it says, okay, I want to return all elements with this tag name, button. And I'm going to store the result in here. Now look at the difference. This is an HTML collection of HTML button elements. This one is a HTML element. It's not even a specific element. It's one HTML element, any HTML element. I don't know what this HTML element is. It's just an HTML element. This is specific HTML elements. It's called HTML button elements. Okay. So there's different reasons for using this. Okay. So if I print this out, then if I go to, again, let's do the thing if buttons, because I'm going to make sure that buttons exists. So it's like we have buttons on the screen. If we don't have them, that would be bad, right? Then I want to say, okay, console log buttons. I want to see what that gives me. And if I double click here, you can see that I get an HTML collection of 3 buttons, right? So there's a button nav bar. Look at that. Remember that was a button? This little hamburger, like I talked about before. That's what it was called. By the way, if I refresh now that it's maximized, and if I go through, even though it's hidden, right, it still finds this button navbar toggler. It does. You just can't see it because it's a hidden element, right? Okay, so for people who are going to question about this. So notice if I go here, you can see it identifies that button. It identifies this button, and it identifies this button. All 3 buttons now are something that I can use. And it gives it to me in this array-like structure, right? It's not really an array. It's button elements. That's what they are, a button element collection. Okay? So that's what it does, more than one. But what if I want to do the same thing with get elements by tag name, and I want to get this button? Okay, well, I can't specifically get this button, right? Unless I know how many buttons are on the page, which is a pain, right? I mean, there's 0, 1, 2 in that order, right? So if I know that this one is this element right here, and I want to get that one, then I could use this thing like an array. So I could say, let's put at the end, and guys, forgive me for this, because I know people are going to freak out when I do this. I want to get the first element, or the 1th the 1th element that is part of all the elements that I find, all the buttons on the page. I want to get the 1th element, which is the 2nd element. Now if I hover over buttons, I get one HTML button element. Okay, this is a different result than what I had before. Okay, so if I double click, you can see now that when I hover over this, they're the same thing. Look, right? If I want to target this one, I can just change this number to 2. And now what I get is this is button 1 and this is button 2. Okay? So I could do that as well. Hopefully that's clear. Is it? Check marks for clear, X's for no. Let's see if you guys got it. Can you hear me, guys? So no, it's not clear. And check mark for a couple people. So Joseph, it's not clear for you. Maybe in chat you want to say why you find it's not clear, how this works. Or you can also turn on your mic if you want. I want to make sure that we understand, because if you don't understand this part, then going forward, it's not going to make it easier. It's going to make it harder. So I'm taking it really slow for this reason. I'm taking it slow because sometimes I get the index number. Okay, you get the index number. But the idea is that I don't get the elements command. Okay, so elements, any elements, that means it's like, hey, it's like saying to JavaScript, it's like this. Hey, JavaScript, hey, document, I'm looking for all elements on the page, every single element, element meaning any node, right, that's on inside the document object model, any node, by tag name. Remember, elements, what's the difference between an element and a tag, first of all? You guys know? Maybe someone can answer me on chat. What's the difference between an element and a tag? There is a difference. Okay. I'm not really getting a response. Maybe you guys are formulating it or typing it in. I can't see. But let's, element is a section. Element is individual. Tags can be grouped. Like div, tags are in angle brackets. I like Steve's comment. Tags are in angle brackets. That's good. So let's talk about what a difference in a tag and element is. So here, if you notice, this is a div element, right? Notice the element, this, and everything else it contains. All of this. That's a div element. But the div tag is right here. Div tag, right? The element contains the div tag plus attributes plus anything that's inside of it, all right? That's the element. The div tag is just the tag on the outside and this part. So a main element has main plus all of this stuff plus the closing tag. Some tags or some elements are self-closing. All right. So you have an element, for example, that only has one tag and a closer. We'll talk about those later on, right? But most of the time, you have an opening tag now and a closing tag. Okay, most of the time in an element. So here's an H1 element. You have both the H1 tag, you have an attribute, which is the class attribute, you have a text node, and you have the closing tag. All of this makes up the H1 element. Okay, so that should make sense. So now if we sit there and go back to our code, right? Remember, it needs to know about JavaScript. If I go back to my code now and I go, hey, document, I'm looking for all the elements with a tag that has button, that has button. All elements that have a button tag. Well, there's one over here, there's one over there, and there's one over there. There's 3 of them on the page, right? This one is hidden. If you want to see this one up here, if you go to index.html and you open up the header, you can see that there is indeed a button element, right? Right here with a button tag, button, right? That's this whole thing. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies a little bit of what the difference between a tag and an element is. Okay, so going back to code then, hey, hey, document, get me all the elements, get a reference. When I mean a reference, I mean pointers. Give me pointers, memory locations of all the elements that have a tag name button. Okay, and if I was to take this away, just this part, this is we're going to return a collection of elements. So an array of button elements, because it's going to return more than one. And the clue to this is elements, whereas this one is element, one element. This is more than one element, right? That's going to return. If I only want one, the first one, the second one, or the third one, then I can specify an index. I can say, give me the 0th element, right? Which is going to be this button up here. All right, so if I save, and if I do that, now you can see that there is a button up here, and it gives me the entire button back. Right, this one up here. Okay, the 0th element. So that's another way you can select. So you can select more than one element. You can select only one element, but what I'm trying to do is make a hook, let's say, to multiple elements. This is what this does. This makes a hook to multiple elements. And you can see now I'm going to get back a collection of elements, almost like an array, but not quite an array. All right, next, let's do other things. So what about other things you can do with document? Hey, document. Oh, God. Hey, document dot. Let's look at what other things it can do. And if I start typing get, and notice that there's other things, elements by class name, elements by name, elements by tag name NS. Interesting. Okay. Let's look at elements by name. What does this do? Right? If I start clicking on this, and if I open a bracket, IntelliSense tells us, it says gets a collection of objects based on the value of the name or ID attribute. Now this is very interesting. So now I want more than one element with the same ID. Okay. So let's try this out. If I say that the ID attribute is called click me button, right? And if I press curly brace, or sorry, and if I go, hey, if let's name this thing. So we'll call this like click me buttons. Let specifically all click me buttons is equal to this. And if I say if click me buttons exists, if I was able to get click me buttons, which is different than click me button, then I want a console log click me buttons. Okay. So if I was to do this as an example, and now you can see now I've got something totally different. Look, here it gave me a HTML collection. Here it gave me a node list of 0. Even though it said, hey, I can use anything that has click me button on it, it says elements by name, right? Element name is the one I'm looking for. Okay, so it's either the name attribute or the ID attribute. That's what it says. It says it gets a collection of objects based on the value of name or ID. Well, it kind of didn't do the second thing. It didn't do ID at all, right? And if I hover over it, it says a node list of HTML element. That's what it did. Okay. Well, let's make this really apparent. If I go back to index.html and let's hide the header again so I have more room. And as an example, I gave each of these, I'm just going to double click here to give myself more room. I gave each of these things the same name. So I have a name attribute. That's an attribute. Name is equal to, I don't know, we'll call this click me button again. Actually, we'll just make it something else so we can really differentiate. Like Tom's button. Can't do Tom, but Tom's button like this. Okay? So we'll say a couple of those. We'll say there are a couple of elements that have the name Tom's button on there. Okay? So there's ID, there's class, and there's name. Let's see Tom's button. Let's see what that returns now. So again, double click, go back here, right, as an example. And again, when we do this, so here's this thing and here's this thing, we get a node list, and the list is empty. All right. So what happened? How come it didn't happen? I mean, it passed the test, right? It passed here. But when it came to us printing it out, right? This was a node list of HTML elements. It's not an array. And so the first one probably worked too, right? It just shows us that the item, the value, is 0. Length is 0, right, for this one. Get elements by name. By name, right? So even though he's the name attribute didn't find any of them, right? It's funny how JavaScript works. Just be careful when you look at some of these advanced functions. How about this? Let's try the class name. So get elements by class name. Okay, how do I do that? Let me just reformat this. I'll change this in a second. We'll call this the button class. So we'll call this buttons with button class. Okay, a really funny way of doing it. Okay, so buttons with button class. We'll look at instead of by name, we'll say by class name this time, and we'll look at any elements that have the btn class name. Okay, so that means if I look at index.html, look, this one has a btn class name built into it. And how about the nav? Does navbar have that too? Let's take a look. So if I look at the button, it doesn't, right? So it looks like it doesn't have. It has navbar toggler, but it doesn't have the button class as, or btn class as a name, right? So if I kind of collapse that and go here, it should only find these two elements here. Okay, let's see what it found. Uh-oh. Well, I didn't change this because there is no more click me buttons, but see the error, that ugly error that came out? I meant, let's do, oops. Let's find anything that has buttons with button class. Okay, now it did it. It returned another HTML collection. This worked. And it gave me two buttons. 0 button is this one, and the 1th button is this one. So 0th and the 1th. Okay? That's how it is, these two buttons here. So it did return a length of 2. Okay? So this one worked. Get elements by class name. This targets multiple elements with the same class. Okay? And by the way, what if there was a complicated class like button and then button primary? Because does that work? Can I make the space happen here like this? Button dash primary. If I did this, you're going to see that it returns that as well. Look, button primary. I didn't even put a dot or anything. It just found that. It kind of used both classes, which is kind of intelligent to hone in on those two things, right? A good example of that is, let's suppose one button was button primary and the other button was button dash warning, the yellow button. I'll show you how that looks. So if I just change this one to button dash warning, right? You can see one button is yellow, the other one's blue. But in my app.js, I'm saying, hey, I want you to target all elements by class name with button primary. Well, guess what? It only returns one, just this one. This one doesn't meet criteria because I'm looking for both classes. Okay? Is that clear now? I'm just looking to see on the if I see check marks, I'm good. If I see X's, that's no. Okay, thanks. That's good, Joseph. I'm glad you got it. Anyone else have a no? I got some check marks on the bottom there. Okay, I'm checking for understanding, guys, because JavaScript ramps. Okay, it ramps. It starts off really slow like this, and then all of a sudden it gets crazy, right? So if you don't get this part, then I'm going to do the next part, and you're going to be like, wait, but how did it? And then it's too late because I've already gone by that part. All right, so this is kind of a way of selecting. So there's a couple ways of showing you here that you can do it. Tag name, but this returns multiple elements. This returns multiple elements. If I want the first one that matches, then I can put a 0 in front of it, right? That always gives me the first match, 0, right? Because that is like me saying, hey, I want to find that one element that matches this pattern, okay? So if I did that now and press save, I'm going to get a different return. I'm actually going to get the button because what this does is it's like this one. I'm just doing it in a different way. So both ways are very similar. However, I want to point out one thing. How JavaScript views things. If I use document.getElements by class name and say something like button primary, right? Notice that it says, if I hover over, I'm going to get an element. right? Any element, by the way. Okay? Not even an HTML element. Something. Because a lot of different elements can have classes, right? If I hover over with this one, get elements by tag name, and press the 0th element, or let's say the 1th element this time, because we want to get the same button, right? And if I hover over now, you can see that this one tells me it's an HTML button element. Okay? So this is buttons with class name, buttons. And if I did it this way, it tells me it's an HTML element. Guys, these are 3 different things from a data type perspective. HTML element, HTML button element, HTML, or just an element by itself. All 3 things have different functionality, if you will. For example, if I know that this buttons element that I just pulled up is indeed a button, I can literally look at code hinting for this. I can say buttons dot, and here are all the things that work with buttons. The click event, the inner HTML, the class name, and a bunch of other things that only are related to buttons. Okay? However, notice that if I do click me button, I might get a different list. Click me button dot, I get append child, style, inner HTML, but I don't get the other stuff that comes up right away as a quick hit. Okay? So that tells you that it's JavaScript is treating each case, this one, and this one, even though they point to the exact same element in different ways, it treats them differently. So be careful which search criteria you use. And take a look at what it tells you. If you hover over, Visual Studio Code tells you the type of data that's being returned. This is super important, guys. And this is what causes a lot of bugs in people's code. They don't understand how this works. And they're like, wait, but I thought I was supposed to get the button. You did get the button. But JavaScript is seeing that as an HTML element, not as a HTML button element. Different things. Okay? And this is where people get confused. All right, so hopefully that clarified a little bit. Let's get back to this. So this is kind of some other things. You can also use something called query selector all. We'll talk about that later. And query selector. All right. Different properties. This again, if you look at the DOM properties, there's different kinds of things that come with the DOM, the actual document itself, the document properties. The document has a body. So if I look for document.body, I don't have to put an ID on the body, right, as an example, or, although I could, right? For example, if I go back to my page, my index.html page, I could put an ID on the body, right, and say this is like, you know, body. I mean, and I could get get element by ID, document.getElementById by body, and then it would point to this element, right? But there is a shortcut. We know sometimes we want to get a hold of the body for the entire document, and so developers, JavaScript has basically allowed us to. We know that body must exist in every document, so therefore they just give you access to it directly. Document.body. Same thing with title, and a bunch of other stuff, right? One thing that's really interesting is this idea of document.location, right? And document.referral and document.url. Let's look at those for a second. So if I was to go back into our app.js and I want a console log document.location. Okay, so there's document.location. Let's also do a console log document.url, right? See what the difference is. Those are all part of the document, see? Location. And let's say referrer too. Referrer, we're going to get a funny thing. Console.log document.referrer. Okay? And if I was to do this, and let's take a look at our page again, we're going to get some funny things here. So we get a location, which is HTTP localhost 3000. Take a look up there. It's almost like what we see up here in the on the URL bar, right? Ancestor origins, DOM string list, origin, HTTP localhost 3000, protocol HTTP. We get a lot of information for the location. Then the next one, document.url, is just this, and document.refer is, they're all the same, right? Now, if I was going to assign variables to all these things. Let's do that instead. So I can say that let document location is equal to, we'll just move this up there, so cut paste. Okay, and let's say let document dot URL is equal to document URL, right? If I can spell document URL, I meant this, that's why it's giving me an error. And let's suppose also that let document referrer equals to, I'll just type it, document.referrer. And then I want to take this one and put it in here. And I want to take this one, put it in here. And I want to take this one and let's just redo this one. There we go. Okay, now what do I get? Well, same, but how about here? Look, this is a location. This is a string, and this is a string. So these two things don't know anything, right? They're just strings. Dumb strings is what I like to call them, right? But this one is chock full of information, and that's why we get all of this stuff. It's an object that we're returning. And so are, by the way, all of these. All these things are objects being returned, and so is this one. But this one has all kinds of information. The host name, href, origin, path name, all kinds of crazy stuff that you get by using location as opposed to URL or referrer. If all you care about is the URL and you want to make a string of it, then use that one. Okay? If you want to know who referred you to this page, that's the document referrer. Okay, and we're going to come back to this in a second. So that is part of the document object model. Okay? So that's some interesting stuff. Document title, obviously we know what that is. But it's important to understand what the document title is because we can, a lot of times we use it for switching, page switching. We'll talk about it in a second. So let's go down. We kind of covered this. And if you look through this, it says var. Oh, God. Don't look at var. var doesn't exist. But the idea is the same. In this particular case, we have an element with an ID value of zip. And here we're getting back a reference to this element. Okay? That's the important keyword, reference, right? Elements by tag name returns an array, array-like structure of elements, we'll say. So we can do that too. And because it's an array, and if we looked at looping structures as in a second, and I'm just going to erase some of this stuff because this is just for testing. Okay? So let's suppose, I'm just going to get rid of all this. And I want to look at all the buttons. Here's the buttons. And I don't care about this one. I'm not going to search by one button right now. Let's just, for our sake of simplicity, let's just comment this part out. So I'm going to edit, and I'm just going to toggle block comment out. So these are out. So I just want to have this first one back, which is this, right? But I want to see the whole list. Instead of one element, I want to see the whole list of elements again. So here's a list of elements, an HTML collection. There's 3 of them. Well, now you can use different looping structures for this. For example, you can say something like the following. There's a for each loop that you might have learned about in C#. This is one of the most common ways of doing it. If you press tab, you need the array or collection. Let's see if this works for each. There's different ones, by the way. Okay, so the collection is called buttons. So I replace array with buttons. This is how you use this one. Okay, so buttons. So for each something in buttons, for each button in buttons, do something. Let's console log that one separately. All right, console log the button that I'm finding. Okay, so each button, for each button. And if I was to do that, then now you're going to get a weird error, right? It's going to say, wait a minute, I know what you want to try and do, but dude, there is no button in buttons. In fact, buttons is not really an array. It says it's an HTML collection of HTML buttons element. Not what I wanted. Even though it said in the documentation that it is an array, right? And I can loop through an array with for each loop, right? So this, not really a go, okay? Let's try something else. How about we type for, and there's another one. There's a for loop, a classic for loop, okay? And let's use this thing, buttons, as an array, right? So I'll say for let index is 0, where index is less than buttons.length. We know buttons has a length because I did that already. Index plus plus, right? And what I want to do is I want to console log, right, each button, which is buttons index. Does this work? The for loop, regular for loop. All right, so yes, right? I have two buttons. I have button 1. There's actually 3. Button 0, button 1, and button 2. And it looped through each of the buttons and printed them out. And this is a good way of doing operations on each of the buttons that it's finding. Okay, that's what it does. So the for loop definitely is one way of doing it. I can kind of go through, look at the buttons with an index, and loop through that way. Let's try one more. There's also a for in. For in is actually not what we're looking for. It's like key value pairs. This is really for an object. I'm looking at a particular object. I'm looking for a specific key in an object. For example, for every button in the buttons array, right? I want to, if buttons has a property called button, this doesn't make any sense. Then I don't know, element. This element is the button of buttons. So this is like an index, kind of. Doesn't make sense. So this is not going to work. All right. So that's for in. Then there's for of. Now this looks like different things. So const, button of object buttons for every button of buttons. This kind of looks like it makes sense. Console log the button. How does that work? Yay, we're good. That's another way of doing it. So for every button in buttons, we use a for of loop. Right? So those are the 3 different looping structures. Right? You can see that I have access to the buttons just like before. Right? This would be my preferred method. We don't know how many buttons there are. I don't know how many to count. I could also use buttons.length, but I recommend using something like this because then you have access to each of the buttons separately without using indexing. All right? Iteration is better over indexing. Okay, using the iterator, built-in iterator. Okay, so this is the preferred method. But you have to know which for loop works best. So again, for each, no. For in, no. A regular for loop, yes, but you need to use an index. And for of, best of all of them for what you need to do. Okay, for what we're trying to do here. So that's something about what type of a collection it returns. It returns a collection, but it's not necessarily an array. Not always. Really depends on the type that you're getting back. So where it says it returns an array of elements, I tend to differ. I don't think that's exactly correct. Collection of HTML elements, yes, but it doesn't really. It's not really an array. Not the way it's presented here. There's other ways of it's array-like, but it's not an array. All right, and it talks about this where you use the number 1. We covered that already. We covered get elements by class name, which kind of covers that. And, the idea that you can look at 2 classes instead of 1. It uses both to kind of skim down there. Get elements by name. And, yeah, that doesn't always work, as we saw. And it says, not standard in IE9 and earlier versions of IE, so important to test. You can obviously check to see that it didn't quite work even for Chrome properly. So I don't recommend using elements by name. Okay, here's query selector. This is kind of neat. So in the past, we couldn't do this. We used jQuery for this instead, right? But query selector is very funny. So if I say we'll call this buttons query, right? Equal to document dot query selector. There's 2. There's query selector and query selector all. Okay. If I open this up and it says, okay, so what am I looking for? Button. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. So query selector, it says. Now, I have to be honest. This is like button. That's how it's going to be, right? So what does this return? So again, hover over this thing to see. It says it's an HTML button element. It returns the first button that it finds. First button. So it'll find this one up here again. All right? That's what this does. First button, buttons query, or we'll call this button query, just to make sure it's different than buttons query. But if I was to use query selector all, let buttons query is equal to document dot query selector all, and now we can look at a query for all buttons, and now we see what we get. If you look here, we get a single HTML element. We get here, we get a node list of buttons. By the way, a node list of buttons is different than a HTML collection of buttons. How do I loop through this one? So this is a single one, no problem. We know what that does. These are neat, okay? But what about buttons query? What does that do? How do we search through? So first of all, we always want to search to see if it's there. So buttons query, if we get something, because what if it doesn't exist? What if it doesn't match or something? You're going to get an error. It's going to break your code, right? So if buttons query doesn't exist, then it won't go here. If buttons query does exist, it'll go here, and we can check. We can say that, okay, buttons query. Let's try a for each loop now. For each, regular one. And we're going to replace the buttons query in here into the array, and we're going to call this the button, just like we did last time. And let's see if what happens here. So console.log, and then we'll do the button that we want out. Does this work? Yes. So you see, a for each loop works nicely with a node list, right? Node list of, no problem. For each loop, right? And this would be, for me, the old style for each loop. Now, one thing it does also use is a fat arrow function that you can simply replace, if you really want to, with a function. Okay, that's what it can be here. All right, but it's not required. Leave it the way it is. This is a good way of doing it. So this is one way of doing it. Okay, how about the for of? Does that work anymore? So let's comment this one out. So we'll comment it out, right? And let's try a for of. That works. So for of, and then we'll replace the thing. So the iterator is called button, and the object is called buttons query. Okay. So buttons query, I'm iterating through this. Here's the iterator, button, does it work? And I'll just do a console log the exact same way to see, to see what it gives me. Yes, we're good still. So now this is like 2 for 2, right? This for of loop works great for both node lists as well as HTML collection of. But this only works for node lists. So guess what? What would I rather use? This one, because it always works, right? As opposed to the other one, right? I mean, so far, anyway, right? So that's something to note, guys. And we can try the other one, but we know it's not going to work. For loop also would work because, well, let's actually, I'm gonna let you see it for yourself. Edit, and we'll toggle block comment, and let's try a regular for loop in here. So for, and here's the index for the array. This is the node list. We'll put in buttons query, right? And we'll just go buttons query index is the thing that we want to, that's dumb, is the thing that we want to print out. So we'll do a console, we'll wrap a console log around that. Okay, there we go. So console log buttons query index, because buttons query is the thing that we're looking at. I know I'm going into this over and over again, guys, but this is what messes you up when you do your stuff. So does it work? Yes, it's good. You can also do it this way. So for loop, no problem, right? For of, no problem. For each, don't know. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, depending on if it's a node query list or if it's a HTML collection of. HTML collection is different than a nodes query, node list of. Okay, please be aware of that. Hopefully I've made that abundantly clear. All right, so I recommend for most times using for looping structures. Okay, so we can say just for our notes then that worked, right? And this one also worked, right? And if you really wanted to go through it, you could also go up here and say which didn't work, which worked. Again, I recommend this one. All right, so that is node, your query selector. Query selector is interesting because it allows you to use CSS syntax, just like it says. So for example, I can say, I want to look at a header and with an HTML tag, and inside the HTML tag, there's an image tag. And it'll find that match, which is awesome, right? In fact, query selector is one of the best ways of finding a specific element on the page without knowing its ID or its class name. All right, if you wanted to target that. And query selector all is exactly the same way, but it finds all elements like that match those things. So it's really, really cool. In fact, nowadays with query selector and query selector all, it almost eliminates the need for jQuery at all. We can almost eliminate that entire library. What jQuery was really good at before was using CSS syntax. Text content. This is really important too. Text content actually zeroes in on the node, the text node of an object. So example would be, let's take a look again at my index.html. Okay, so I'm going to just double click over here and open it up. Hello world. Okay, notice that the h1 element has a couple of things. The h1 tag, the class attribute, as well as the hello world subnode or the text node. This node, hello world, is inside of the h1 element. It makes up the entire h1 element. However, you could have an empty node in here instead. No node inside the hello world. Okay? Just letting you know. So if I wanted to get this from my h1 tag, I could get elements by tag name, h1, and then look at the text content. Okay, let's try that out. So I'm going to go back to my app.js, right? Again, I'm just adding to this thing. I'll put this up later on, up online. But more or less, it's just for us to practice. So think about it as a kind of a sandbox that we're playing in right now. Okay. So I'm going through here and I'm exploring. I'm going to say, okay, well let's let the hello world. I want to get hello world, and I want to get it from. I know that there's an h1 element, so I'm going to say document.get elements by tag name h1, right? So notice that if I put in h1, it's the first h1 element. This will return the first, all the elements with h1 tags. I want to get the first one, right? So that hello world now is returning an HTML heading element. Okay, that's important to know. Okay, so this is definitely one way of doing it. You could also use document.getElementById, give the h1 tag an ID of something like main heading or something like that, and then you get a different way of getting it back. But here we know this is an HTML heading element. Okay, cool. And then what I can simply do is I could say that another variable, I could say that, actually let's use the same one. Let's use the same one to make it more contextual for you. So this is the element, the h1 element, but hello world is what I want. And I want to get that by going to the h1 element, then going dot, and I want two things. You can go inner HTML or text content. All right, and there's also, sorry, one more, inner text. There's inner text, text content, and inner HTML. Let's look at all of them. Let's look at inner HTML. So inner HTML, if I did this, and hello world itself, and if I console log hello world, then, let me bring that back. Then you can see that I get hello world. Right? And this looks indistinguishable. Hello world, there it is, right? And I can use inner HTML. what? But that's not HTML, right? That is isn't that a tag? Isn't that a text content? What is that? It's actually a node, is what that is. Okay, so let's get back to this. Next option, I can do it this way. That returns what I want. I can also do text content. Save, and to the untrained eye, it's the exact same. Hello world, text content, no difference, right? Haha. And the last one is inner text. Okay, and again, to the untrained eye, all the same, right? But actually, what you should really look at is what it returns here. This is a string, okay? And again, this is why I'm saying untrained eye. You guys should be starting to train yourselves to know what the difference is. Text content, string, inner HTML, string. All right? So they all look the same, but they're treated very differently. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So what if I wanted to look at the element, the inner HTML of my button? Inner HTML of my button. Or let's see, even maybe a better example would be if I want to get the inner HTML of the main tag. This main here, I want to look for the main element, and I want to get the inner HTML of the main element. Let's see how that works. Okay, so going back to app.js, right? We'll leave this alone. Let's put this back at text content. By the way, text content is the right thing to do, right? That's the most modern, most supported way of getting your text from inside of an element, all right? And if I do something like this, if I say we'll call this main inner HTML, so things that are inside the main, I can say that document dot get elements by tag name, and I want to look for main. There's my element, and I want to get the first one, the first element that I find. There it is, and I want to look at the inner HTML. Right. So notice I'm using like dot accessor methods. I'm using something called object chaining here, where I get the first object, which is document, the second object, which is returning this element, and then I'm going to the next part, which is my text content. All right. By the way, I could break this down into multiple variables. Right. The first variable can be relevant to this, and then I could use the first variable and use the text content of that variable. Okay. For example, hello world.text content. Okay. But here I'm just doing it all in one. So if I did this, and if I did a console log, main inner HTML, first of all, what am I getting back? I'm getting a string. Okay, so inner HTML looks like a string. However, look at this. It's a string. It looks like exactly laid out like normal. However, if I go here and change this to text content, I get this. Notice the difference? Main actually contains a bunch of text nodes, right? Hello world, click me, and click me too. Take a look. Click me is here, click me too, and hello world are all text nodes inside of main, right? That's what it is. Main has a bunch of text nodes inside of it. And the way to look at that is, if I go to main, and if I look for any text, here's one, hello world, here's another one, click me, here's another one, they're all white by the way, and here's click me too, right? So those are all the text nodes inside of main. Okay? So that's what that does. That's a different effect when I go text content compared to inner HTML. Inner HTML returns everything. How about inner text? Inner text. What does that do? So that returns this, hello world, click me too, but with no spaces. So there's all three different reasons why you want to get that. All right, inner text, three, pieces of text, hello world, and click me and click me too. Look, click hello world, click me and click me too. It's all one thing with no spaces. That's what it did. It appears actually exactly how it does on the page, with no spaces at all, as if the HTML didn't exist. Okay, so that's, again, each thing has different effects or side effects, if you will, associated with it. So again, please be cognizant of this when you read these documents and what they mean. Okay, so again, if I just want to get text content of a specific element, then text cont is the way to go. Inner HTML, it gets everything. Text content strips out the HTML tags. Inner text strips out the HTML tags and all the spaces too. Okay. So again, one thing that they talked about is that to text content properties more secure, I highly recommend this for sure. Okay. So, and if you're using an if-else conditional statement, it's better to use text content than anything else. Highly recommend. Okay. Okay. So another thing to do before we end for the day is, and we'll end here because I'm kind of running into kind of the middle of the PowerPoint, which is good, is I want to get element by ID, logo, and then I want to set up a style, and display is none. I can hide stuff this way. Okay, let's try and see if I can do this. So if I go back to this, so I want to target an object, and I can change the styling of an object. So if I go back to some of the things I got up here, for example, all the buttons by tag name, right? And if my buttons exist, then for each of the buttons, I want to console log that button, but let's just change the buttons so that they are, I change the style of the text inside the buttons. Okay, let's see how that works. So how does it work, by the way? So remember, if CSS will work, then that'll work as well. So let's try this out. So we'll say that button.style. And you can see that these are all the different things that you can change. So if I wanted to change the font size, let's change the font size, and I want to make that into like 40 pixels, or let's make it even bigger. Because font size, if you hover over font size, it listens for a string, which means you have to put it in quotations. Let's make it so it's obscene, 80 pixels, 80 pixels. All right, so that's the size that I want, and let's see what that does. When I loop through each of the buttons, then I get, crazy amount of size, right? 80 pixels. So I've looped through each of the buttons. Even this one's big. Look, it's massive, 80 pixels, right? Okay, what about if I loop through, and I don't care if it's the first one, only the second one and the third one. So I can say, okay, well, for the first time, if I'm looping through the first time, I don't care about the first button, but I care about the other ones. Cool. So one way to do it is basically to say I can count how many times I've gone through, right? So if my count is, less than 1, for example, I can say something like, I don't know, this is one way of doing it. Let button counts start at 0, and if my button count is 0, so I can say if button count is greater than 0, then do that styling stuff, but don't do it on the original one. All right, so don't do this on this, just on 1 and 2. You can do that, right? And if I save it, you can see that this is the same size, but these ones, oh wait, what happened? If button count, oh yeah, because I didn't increment buttons. Let's increment the button count. So here it goes through once, and then let's go button counts plus plus. There we go. Button count plus plus. Now you're going to see that the first one is untouched, but the other two buttons are big. Okay? So it's another way of looping through and affecting some, but not others. Okay? And I could have also done other ways. I could have got a list back of buttons and checked the list, and maybe there's some other attributes that I want to check through to increase the size of. But you can use any CSS styles here to affect these things. Now, caution. Why would I is the question. Should I? Would I ever do anything with JavaScript that affects my style in hard-coded format like this? And I'll tell you guys, unless there's a special effect that you want that's going to go away later on, the answer should be no. No, you should not do it. Don't use CSS where CSS can be used. CSS is very powerful, right? And I also wanted to mention the three, kind of layers that we want to talk about, right? So think about this. At the very top, you have your structure layer. The structure layer is your content. I got my content, whatever I'm going to say here. I got some content here. Hello world, right? That's content. And then if I don't have good content and if I don't have good structure around my content, then who cares about CSS? There's no content, right? So content and structure around the content is number one. Second thing is use CSS. CSS3 is so powerful. You can avoid doing half the operations in JavaScript, more than half now, with just CSS. It's so powerful to use, right? So think about CSS second. And then third, after you've done all your presentation, if you want to add behavior, which CSS doesn't cover, then you add JavaScript. That's the third layer, all right? And that's how it should be done. Unfortunately, what some JavaScript developers do is they don't know CSS very well, and they use hard code everything with JavaScript, and it becomes a mess to maintain later on, which is not something you want to do. However, it is there, and you can use it. And sometimes it can be very interesting, the effects that you can kind of put together with a combination of CSS and JavaScript. And that's what that does. And I think, yeah, it just shows us more CSS and JavaScript. I'm not going to go beyond that. You can say that we can change the color, the style, and that's where I want to stop. So around page 30 on the PowerPoint. Okay, so now any immediate questions about things that you have any kind of problem with, the stuff that we've talked about. If you have a question, now would be a great time to talk about it. For example, if you don't understand something in terms of how we hook into an element, we make a reference to an element. Otherwise, if you're clear, I'll end the stream now, and then we'll talk more about this stuff on Wednesday with your assignment number 2. Anybody? Yes. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff you can do with CSS, and it's amazing. So I'm going to point you to a site that I want you to take a look at for those people who are interested. It's called CSS Zen Garden, okay? Which is an awesome site to look at. And there's a bit of a challenge with this one. So if you want to learn how to do CSS awesome, here's a place to look. And if you want to study CSS design, the challenge was you can only use CSS-based design. Okay, you can't use JavaScript. And basically what they do is they take the same exact content and spin it with CSS. So everything you see here has been done with CSS. For example, if I go to garments, everything that's done here in this page, the effects that you see here are all done with CSS. Okay? Apothecary, here's another site. The exact same content, guys. All done with CSS. Nothing's changed. All right? Look, it's just a different way of presenting everything. A robot named Jimmy. All right? Look, there's some animation, a robot, and everything done with CSS. No JavaScript whatsoever. Okay? No JavaScript. So that's really cool. So take a look at this. Yes, JavaScript, not Java. But there's some really awesome things that you can do just with CSS. And I highly recommend looking at CSS Zen Garden. And you can look at the stuff that they've done here. Now, I'll tell you this, that developers in general don't like CSS. They don't like it because they still got to wrap their minds around it and what it does. Think about it as another layer of querying. I create my structure, I create my markup, and then I query my markup and modify what I see on the page with CSS. Is it more for designers than developers? You know what? At its current form, CSS3, it's good for everybody, but it's challenging for us to learn. With all respect to the stuff that you learned in the first semester, the stuff you learned in the first semester just scratched the surface of what CSS can do, truly. And if you extend it with SCSS or SAS, right? There's actually other frameworks out there that can compile, to really cool stuff. SAS adds things like variables and all kinds of lovely things that you can do that you can't do with current CSS. It's getting better, and the next version of CSS hopefully will have more and more stuff. I mean, they've added things like Flexbox and Grid System and everything else we just talked about. And that's why I got a question of, do I really need to use, Bootstrap? At one point, Bootstrap took care of all that stuff, and you can do a lot of it with just plain CSS nowadays. So CSS is pretty awesome. I can't say enough about it, but difficult to learn. So easy kind of to get a hold of, but really hard to master. Like we're talking about, it can take years to really know how to use CSS properly, and you have to have the right use cases and the right examples to get you going. But SAS, CSS with superpowers, we're going to see this again later on. All right, any other questions around the difference between CSS and what would I use CSS or JavaScript? No? Okay, we're good to go. Guys, thank you so much. I'm going to end the stream now. Again, hook back with me on Wednesday when we talk about assignment number 2. I'm going to give you more details around that, and hopefully you'll be good with all that stuff. But for now, I'm going to sign off, and I'll stick around for any kind of questions for the next 10 minutes. Thanks, guys.